Once upon a time, there was a village called Ordinary. Now that was a very appropriate name for that village. There was nothing ghastly about it. It was pleasant, but ordinary. And most of the villagers were also ordinary. But there were a few exceptions. The most exceptional villager was an old woman known as Granny Goodworks. And one of the things Granny did was crochet little animals, little turtles, which she sold at the village marketplace every week. Another thing she did was to take the place of a doctor, because the village didn't have any doctor. If anyone in the village was ill, or if they had a sick child, or even a sick animal, they would take a small gift to Granny, and she would give them a potion that she had brewed herself. And it always took care of the problem. Occasionally, an unhappy young person would call on Granny with a gift. And not very long afterward, that same young person would be happily announcing an engagement. And Granny was known, and if anyone ever thought of another W word in connection with Granny, they never said it out loud. Now the other three people who were not ordinary in the village were not pleasant either. One of them was a woman who was known as Greedy Gertie. Whenever there was a potluck, a picnic, or a party in the village, Gertie was there, whether or not she'd been invited. And the villagers were all too pleasant to tell her to go away if she hadn't been. She would always force herself to the head of the food line, grab 2 plates, pile them high, sit down, and immediately start eating just as fast as she could. As soon as she'd eaten that, she would force her way back to the head of the line and repeat the process. Sometimes there was no food left for people at the end of the line. Then one market day, when Granny set out her wares, people noticed that there was a pig among the turtles. As they came closer to look, they realized that it had a considerable resemblance to Greedy Gertie. And they whispered and laughed about that, had a good time. It wasn't until the next day's picnic that people realized that Gertie wasn't there. And nobody had seen her for a few days. And nobody ever saw her again. Another non-ordinary person was a man who was known as Grabby Gus. No one had ever seen Gus take anything, but it was a fact that every time Gus was in the area, things disappeared. For instance, if Gus was in this room, that bag would have disappeared. That hat would have disappeared. The timing light would have disappeared. And one market day, when Granny set out her wares, there was an octopus. And when people noticed how much that octopus resembled Gus, they didn't laugh. They just whispered together. And then several of them went to his house. They never did find Gus, but inside his house they found all the items that everybody had been missing. Now the last non-ordinary person in the village was a woman known as Big Mouth Bertha. If anyone had a secret of any kind, especially if it was embarrassing, Bertha always managed to find out about it. And she would tell everyone in a way that would cause the most embarrassment or humiliation. She never had a kind word to or about anyone, but she had plenty of unkind words. The villagers used to say that Bertha's big mouth had a bad bite. So one market day, when Granny set out her wares, and they saw a crocodile that resembled Bertha, nobody laughed, nobody whispered, nobody went to her house. They just looked at each other and smiled. And ever since then, the village of Ordinary has been even more ordinary, definitely more pleasant. And all of the people in it are pleasant and ordinary, except for Granny Goodworks, who is pleasant, but very definitely not ordinary. She's still known as the village wise woman. And if anyone ever thinks of another W word in connection with her, they never ever say it out loud. Had a